Over a year and a half ago, my personal least favorite FNAF book was released, The Security Breach Files. As someone who enjoys reading every FNAF book, even this one, I do think this book is kinda completely pointless, and like the other FNAF guidebooks, it gets some things wrong. I made a video about it a year late, which you could check out if you want to. However, in this video, I'll be making that other one basically obsolete, because a couple days ago, the updated version of this book came out. Similar to the Freddy Files books, the Security Breach Files updated with the content that released since the last one did, but kept most of the previous stuff the same. So in this video, I'll be going over everything I noticed in this book that I think is worth talking about, including all the problems I talked about in my video on the first Security Breach Files book if they are to remain in the book. The ultimate guide, while keeping many issues of the first two Freddy Files books, also fixed some mistakes of those books, so did the Ruin updated Security Breach Files book get the same treatment? Let's find out. As with the original Security Breach Files, I have to say I do really like the style of the pages and everything, but the cover is once again pretty goofy. On the original cover, there were images of Freddy, Monty, Chica, and Vanny. I always found this weird because it shows 3 of the 4 main Pizzaplex performers and then just subs in Vanny for some reason. I don't know why Roxy isn't on the cover, but what's weirder is that for the cover of the updated edition, they did the exact same thing. The same 3 main characters are there, Freddy, Monty, and Chica, and they swapped out one rabbit character for another. Instead of Vanny, it's now Mix's. On the backside of the original book was the exact same image of Vanny that was on the cover, which is kinda stupid, but now on the updated edition, it is still the same Vanny image. Mix's being on the cover makes more sense than Vanny since he actually appears a good amount in the game, unlike Vanny, but the fact that Roxy just isn't, but the other 3 main characters are there, is just really weird. As I began to read the book, I found that almost all the problems that were in the original are still here, and I'm going to talk about them just like I did with the last one. The first page of the first chapter basically tries to tell us that prior to the events of the game, Gregory was here at the Pizzaplex to have fun. The book completely ignores the fact that Vanessa is looking for him before the place even closes, and if he was there for fun, he could have just walked out the front door. We know due to stuff in the game and in GGY that Gregory isn't normal at all, and the controversial idea of him being a robot isn't even what I'm talking about here. The escape ending of the game shows us that Gregory is homeless at the moment, and we know from GGY and the therapy tapes that Gregory was at one point possessed by Glitchtrap. Bearing this in mind, it's very likely that Gregory was staying in the Pizzaplex before Vanessa started going after him, which leads to the events of the game. The book barely acknowledges the fact that she is after him before the Pizzaplex closes, as well as the fact that he literally had to hide from her inside Freddy, which he wouldn't have had to do if he was just here for fun. Oh yeah, and I'm also not gonna let it slide that the book referred to the chase sequences as scary. They aren't. The book also has a bit of a problem with consistency. It sometimes says one thing and later in the book says something that contradicts that. We know that the animatronics in the game are programmed to stop intruders, though they are obviously doing so in ways they shouldn't do due to the fact that they are corrupted by Glitchtrap. However, at one point in the book, it's mentioned that outside of Freddy, who was the only one who got fried during the performance, the other Glamrock animatronics are trying to stop intruders because they are following their programming. Again, this isn't really wrong, but the book states at an earlier point that the animatronics are malfunctioning. Those two things can't really both be true at the same time. Later on the same page where it says they're following programming, we also see artwork of the green rooms for Chica, Monty, and Roxy. What's weird though is that Chica's green room does not say Glamrock Chica like it does in the game, instead saying Chica Chicken, which it did say in the February 2021 Security Breach trailer, which was changed in the final game. The same mistake is also made a few times later in the book. There's also a page soon after that talks more about Chica, and there's a voice line on the page that they claim is Chica's line. The line is, hey, are you having fun yet? Are ya? However, this line is actually one that Sun says, not Chica. On top of that, the line is also slightly off, as Sun says are ya one more time. This is one of those things that is so easy to get right, so it really makes you wonder how they managed to mess it up. I gotta say, this book's existence is just really pointless. Watching people play the game or playing it yourself gives you more information than this supposed guidebook. And if the book is meant to be for people who didn't get to play the game, that's kinda useless, because unlike the Freddy Files books, it only touches on the surface level stuff. It never talks about anything speculative, and it even leaves some things out. It only tells you what happens, while the Freddy Files books tell you everything you really need to know. And what's worse about this book is that, as I've gone over, it's very inconsistent and sometimes blatantly incorrect. But the the worst thing about the book is that there's times where it's literally written out of order, describing events from the game, and then after that talking about stuff that happened before that. The most egregious example that I noticed of this is when it's describing the mini Music Man section from 1 a.m., then goes to Vanessa catching us, which is at the very end of the hour, then after that it starts talking about the loading dock, which is before Vanessa catches us, and then goes back even further to the Pizza Bot minigame. There's quite a few other examples too. The book seems to be made for people who don't know what happened in the game if they didn't play it, but then it gets parts of the game wrong and describes the events out of order, so it's not really good for what it's trying to be. Jumping ahead to right before 3 a.m., the game gets something wrong in a really funny way. The reason it's funny is because it's something that's so easy to get right, yet somehow they still get it wrong. If you just watch like 5 seconds from this part of the game, you will see what actually happens. The book claims that when 3 a.m. is nearing, Gregory remembers that Moon will be coming soon, and right on cue, Moon shows up. This is hilariously wrong, as Gregory doesn't just remember that Moon is going to show up, instead, he literally just reacts to seeing Moon show up in that moment. Now that we've talked about a bunch of negatives in this book and things that it didn't fix, let's talk about the one thing that they actually did fix, which I'd like to actually give them credit for. In the original security breach files, when Phaser Blast is described, it is stated that it is similar to the game Capture the Hill, but the thing is that Capture the Hill is not a game. King of the Hill is, but it's nothing like Phaser Blast, and Capture the Flag is also a game, which is what Security Breach blatantly tells us Phaser Blast is. But the book said that it was like Capture the Hill, yet it went on to describe Capture the Flag. However, in the updated edition, they actually fixed this, changing it to say that Phaser Blast is Capture the Flag. Good on them for fixing it, though that's basically the only pass they get. Something I want to mention now is something that I didn't even notice when I read the first book. When talking about the sewer section of the game, the book claims that Chica's beak assists Gregory in getting through a door, which isn't true, but then it goes on to not at all acknowledge the existence of the sticky note room, which is a pretty big thing to just ignore. Later on, when the book talks about the West Arcade sequences, it's said that whoever Gregory didn't decommission will still be active. However, while this is true, the book indicates that the one you did decommission will not be active, which is not true, and both Monty and Chica stay active even after you destroy them. It gets weirder after that though, because it claims you will be hunted in the West Arcade by whoever you decommission, then after that claims that both of them are active, which is another example of the book being inconsistent. Right after that, there's a weird statement that isn't definitively wrong depending on how you play the game, but it kind of just assumes something that is usually unlikely, at least on a first playthrough. The book states that the security badge in the West Arcade is the level 7 security badge. In a typical playthrough though, this one should be the number 6 badge. The reason for that is because there's 2 areas of the game where you can go one of 2 ways, and both of them have their own individual security badges. Because of this, you're most likely to only get 2 of those 4, leaving 2 to be left behind, meaning by the West Arcade security badge, you're probably only at 6, not 7. The only legitimate way to have reached level 7 by this point is to go back and get the badge in the kitchen if you went to Superstar Arcade at 1 a.m, or to go back to Superstar Arcade if you go to the kitchen at 1 a.m. Yes, it's pretty easy to do that, but it's not likely for people to pick doing that over progressing the story unless it's not your first time playing. Another thing I didn't notice when I read the first book is that towards the end, when discussing Gregory staying or leaving, it asks if he will choose to stay, saying that if the answer is yes, then he will head to his quote-unquote home, and if no, then he can investigate further to stop Vanny, but that doesn't make sense. I think the book kind of mixed up the question that it was asking. It asked if he will stay and says that if he does, then he'll go home, and if he doesn't stay, then he can investigate Vanny. It's just a bit backwards. A few pages later, it also claims that the choice to go after Monty or Chica was at 1 a.m, which is of course wrong, as that was at 4 a.m. Right where the original security breach files left off is at least one mistake, or 2, or maybe even 3 depending on what theories you believe. Because of the Mimic, it is debated whether or not Burntrap is still William Afton, or if he's the Mimic, or if he's both. If he is to not be Afton at all, this book got that wrong for actually calling Burntrap Afton. The dead body on Burntrap is very possibly Afton's, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Burntrap is Afton, and the body doesn't absolutely have to be Afton's either, though I believe it is, but if it isn't, it got that wrong too. But one thing it definitely got wrong is the name of FNAF 6, as it refers to FNAF 6 as Five Nights at Freddy's Pizzeria Simulator. It's not an incorrect description of the game, but the book refers to it as if that's the title of the game, which it isn't. The Ruin section of this book begins by explaining a few things that aren't necessarily wrong, but it goes into detail on them in ways that we didn't really receive in the main game. The reason I'm bringing this up is because due to the severe lack of care that seems to be put into this book, it's questionable whether these things are trustworthy. A similar dilemma to the one I personally personally have with other Freddy Files books. These things in particular aren't necessarily important, but I'm just more so concerned about the precedent being set here, whether or not this book can imply theories, or if we should disregard it entirely and purely form theories based on what we see in the actual games and other books due to the inconsistencies and mistakes found in this one. I lean towards the latter. The first actual mistake I did notice in the Ruin section though is that the spelling of Helpy's name in Ruin is wrong here. We know that Helpy from FNAF 6 is spelled H-E-L-P-Y, but the Helpy from Ruin is actually spelled H-E-L-P-I in all caps. The book gets the all caps right, but spells the name with a Y instead of an I. It's not like this is the most egregious mistake in the world, but it is a mistake nonetheless. After the Monty jump scare from the pipe is mentioned, it is stated that Cassie ends up in Monty Golf after she ran away from Monty, but this isn't the case. Monty actually knocked her into the water and she started sinking. Monty Golf is actually on the complete opposite side of the entire building, meaning for whatever reason, Monty deliberately brought her there. I guess it's because the animatronics by this point aren't trying to attack her because they aren't possessed by Glitchtrap anymore. Instead, they're just following their initial programming, which says to not attack kids, only attacking her later when she starts to help the Mimic, as Mixes is tied to them, which is clear since they show up when Mixes gets close. Right after that, the book also refers to Mascbot as Mapbot. Sure, they're very similar and may even be the same animatronics, but they have different names and the book gets it wrong. Later on, it is said that when you deactivate one of the 2 security nodes in a particular area, Mixes spawns. However, if I'm not mistaken, Mixes is not triggered by deactivating the nodes. He is only triggered by wearing the mask for too long, even at the beginning. He can actually spawn for the first time in any area of the DLC. The book continues to claim many other times that he will appear once you complete puzzles or after certain actions, but again, this is not true. Throughout the entire DLC, there aren't any actions except for scripted events that cause Mixes to appear. It always just depends on how long you have the mask on for. Skipping ahead a bit through Ruin to the section with Ruin Freddy, it is stated that in order to get to the inhibitor to turn it off, you need to be stealthy so Freddy doesn't hear you and get you. But that's not true. Freddy comes towards you no matter what you do, and if you try to be stealthy, you'll be too slow and you'll die. You need to get the inhibitor as fast as possible before Freddy gets you. Just a bit after that, we get perhaps the funniest mistake in the entire book, when it talks about Cassie going down into the sinkhole, and it is said that her flashlight gets wet and no longer works. While it is true that the flashlight stops working, it is absolutely not because it gets wet, because it doesn't get wet. The flashlight doesn't get anywhere near the water when it stops working. There's 2 possible reasons why it stops working, neither of them being because it's wet. It either stops working simply because it runs out of battery at the most inconvenient time possible, or it's because the Mimic messes with electronics as we see in the Tales epilogues, causing the electronic battery to shut off when Cassie starts approaching the area the Mimic was in. Speaking of the Mimic, I find it kind of weird that the book straight up name drops the Mimic, which the game doesn't do except for the hybrid name found in the files, yet it doesn't explain anything about the Mimic. It basically just says that Gregory wasn't really Gregory, it was the Mimic copying Gregory's voice, but it explains nothing of who the Mimic is. It also doesn't explain Candy Cadet's story, but it does mention that he tells you one. Hell, it even explains the Scooper ending, but completely leaves out the fact that the Mimic is now wearing a costume. And that's the huge problem I have with this book. It's a guidebook, but it just tells you what happens. For some reason, it's really specific in telling you how to complete the levels in Ruin, but it just leaves a bunch of stuff out and doesn't really explain everything you need to know about the game. I honestly feel like Security Breach and Ruin, as well as Help Wanted 2 and Tales from the Pizzaplex, and maybe even Into the Pit, should have been saved for another new Freddy Files book to be released in the future. Security Breach is the only game that has its own Files book. There was none for Help Wanted 2, and nothing for Tales from the Pizzaplex, obviously, so if you're gonna do one, why not just do it all in the Freddy Files, a book that is actually a really good guidebook even if it also has some errors. The Freddy Files at least actually explain stuff, including the gameplay as well as the lore and theories and pretty much everything you need to know, while the Security Breach Files skips over the lore and theories aspect and also over literal necessary information, leaving behind a book, and now 2 books, that do not need to exist. But that's everything I wanted to talk about for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed, and if you did, make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you want to, and let me know what your thoughts are on this book in the comments down below. Although I talk a lot of crap about this book, and rightfully so, there are a few positives, like the overall design of it, and it is pretty enjoyable to read, but there's so many flaws that I think both iterations of this book are among the worst FNAF books, maybe even the worst. But let me know your thoughts. And that's everything, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye guys!